I think without any further ado, we'll have Emily take over.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I always love getting to interact with the UU community. The work that you all do related to justice is so important. And I think that more and more we need to have the climate outlook in line if we want to realize a potential for an economically just community. So thank you so much for having me here today. My name, like Terry said, is Dr. Emily Schoerning. I am a nonprofit leader. I have a background in education research. So what I've done, I've spent about 10 years doing research and working on the ground to learn how to communicate with people on climate. And I do that now through the nonprofit I founded, American Resiliency, which is the only nonprofit focused on communicating our most likely climate future to the general public. I'm really glad we're going to have a chance to talk together. I'm going to be using the highest consensus scientific sources. So the sources where most scientists agree the most strongly, both international and federal, as I help us to build a picture of the changes that are coming. And right before I get into the slides, I'm going to make sure that I have a chance to see where folks are coming in from. California, New Jersey. We've got another Iowan. Always glad to see more Iowans. I live in rural Iowa myself, Hartwick, Iowa, in Poweshiek County. Oh, Monterey and Santa Barbara. We've got Mount Dora, Florida. All right. And I'll check back in the chat. I'm going to share my slides now, and I might not be able to see the chat while I'm talking. So Terry, if someone has a question that I can't see, please call it out, okay? All right. So we're going to talk about our most likely climate future for America. And to understand this, to understand our outlook, we really need to look at ourselves in a global context. And when we look at the global context for climate change, what I'm going to use to illustrate this is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's AR6 report. This was a high consensus report released this spring in 2023. Those of us who are passionate about climate, we know the Paris Accords, the goal was to stay below 1.5 degrees of total warming. Unfortunately, we have not globally done the work to maintain that threshold. This year seems very likely to have come in at 1.5, although that is related to this year's El Nino phenomena. We can hope that by 2025 we'll go back down. There's a lot of consensus that the most likely future we're heading towards is a 2-degree future. So trying to understand how bad a 2-degree future is a very important justice challenge, as we want to give background to the decisions we make around investment and trade globally. I feel like the best way we can look big picture at how rough things are going to get is looking at species loss. So here we're looking at the percentage of animal species and seagrasses exposed to potentially dangerous temperature conditions. If we look at this scale here, it's not intuitive. If you look up into this mustardy yellow, this whole part of the scale, we're looking at less than 10% species loss. When we start to get into the purple, then we're talking about really terrible extinction level heat, extinction level risks. In a 2-degree future, unfortunately, we do see some purple spots on the map, especially in this biologically and culturally rich, beautiful part of the world here in Southeast Asia. We see very challenging outlooks, the kind of extremely pessimistic outlooks that we see on the news. But I want us to look at North America, where we see that inland North America, there's a very low risk of species loss. In many parts of inland North America, almost no risk of species loss due to heat. This is not fair. The impacts of climate change are not just, they're not equitable, but we do need to understand them if we're going to try and make the best future we can. Let's dig a little bit more into the global outlook as we start to realize that in the US, we're really talking about a fairly privileged position, challenging, but privileged. If we look at 2 degrees future in terms of the annual hottest day temperature change, we do see some hot spots emerging in other parts of the globe that we might have also noticed were at risk for biodiversity loss. particularly around the Mediterranean. Very challenging outlook all around the Mediterranean, in South America, and in already water-stressed South Africa. We do notice that there is a change significant here, kind of at the Canadian border. I'm not as worried about an annual hottest day temperature change in an area that is very cool in terms of direct risk to life, as in an area where the annual hottest day temperature is already very high. Furthermore, let's look at the risks to the US in terms of the change in the total soil moisture column. So that's drought-related changes to soil. If the soil is going to be on average much more dry. The brown is concerning. Those are high drought areas. We see here the outlook for South America much more challenging than North America. The most impacted drying place in North America is right under Arizona, where we're already talking about a very dry habitat. So if I saw this under Washington, I would be very alarmed, right? But here we're looking at an intensification of current trends. I think it's worth noting that around the Mediterranean, we also see this very challenging outlook, and in the breadbasket of Asia, we see potential for drought. So I hope that, like me, you see this and you see that the potential that we have in the United States for continuing agriculture productivity that's starting to emerge from this big picture. Agriculture is the basis of a just economy, is being able to get people the food that they need to do the other tasks of daily life, right? There's a real responsibility that we have to look at what we can do with the outlook we have so that we have enough to give to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is looking at a rougher outlook by and large than those of us in the United States. But even within the United States, there's a lot of variability, and we're going to start to look at that now. We're going to layer up 3 pieces of information over the course of this talk so that we can build a rich picture together. The first thing we're going to talk about is changes to the summer heat. So this map has a lot of colors on it. I'm sorry that it's like a little overwhelming, but we're going to try and break it down to make some sense of it. If you're looking at blue, you're looking at pretty cool summers, pretty much less than a month of days over 86. And here we're talking about degrees F instead of degrees C, like in the last international pages. We can see that as we look at what happens to the blue, there's a big fade as we look towards 2050 under a future heading towards 2 degrees. I think it's worth noting that northern New Mexico and much of mountain Colorado actually looks pretty good in terms of staying pretty cool. When we think about US agriculture, though, I want to focus on this peach colored band right here, where we're looking at Kentucky and Tennessee, Missouri and Arkansas, Southern Illinois, over into Kansas. We know that this is very agriculturally productive territory, right? If we look at the 2050 projection, this peach colored band is moving pretty far north. It's moving far up into the Dakotas, actually, into South Dakota. In this area of the Midwest, right here, this area right here, this is one of the few places in the world that is looking at the potential for increased agricultural production. And as we were talking before the chat began about the importance of preserving farmland for the basis of our just economic systems, I think that this region is a real hot spot for preservation. Over in Washington, we also noticed some expansion to the growing season likely in the Palouse, one of the richest wheat regions in the country. Also good to see. When we look at other places that are staying pretty cool, we can look at some detail at the Northeast here. Look, there's really a lot of regional change depending on elevation in the Northeast. So if you live particularly in New York, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey, you might want to check out a detailed state level forecast on my channel so that you can get a close look at what's likely to happen in your county or even in your town. But there are a lot of places like in northern Vermont, where Burlington is working hard to make itself a welcoming climate destination that have a pretty good summer climate outlook. If we look at what's going to happen down in the South, the Southwest and the Southeast, I want you to notice that there are new colors appearing on the map. If we look at the Southwest, if we look at Southern California and Arizona, we see a dramatic heat up in the 2050 projections that will make things more challenging for these major cities that have a very concrete and car-based design. This is a serious area where we need to build climate resilience for the millions of people who live in this area. Looking over at the Southeast, we can see that the summer climate that characterizes Central Florida today is going to kind of burst out of Florida and go around the Gulf. We're going to talk more about other hazards to the Gulf right now in a little bit as we build out the picture of precipitation. But I think that that's a level of change that's worth noting. If we want to look at what it's going to be like in 2050 in the Southeast, we're talking about a Florida-like climate around the whole Gulf and a climate that's like Mississippi and Alabama today across this broad swath of sort of the middle South. That's going to feel more like the deep South in terms of the summers. But let's look at the winters. Let's look at how the winters are likely to change. We're going to be looking at winter through the lens of plant hardiness zones, which for anyone else who, like me, is a gardener, you know, that lets us know what the low temperature is that plants can overwinter at. So you choose the appropriate trees or shrubs for your climate. And plant hardiness zones let you know when you can plant in the spring, when it's going to be all right to put seeds in. These maps don't look as different, right? They don't look as different as the summer maps. And that's good, because lower change is always going to be easier to adapt to. When we think about those agriculturally productive areas that we were talking about where there's potential for growing season increases, I think it's worth noting that up here in the Pacific Northwest, there's almost no change projected in winter low temperatures. That means the people who are putting in vines and trees now have a pretty reasonable expectation that they're going to be able to continue to get a good crop out of those vines and trees. Whereas other areas, like look at Georgia here. Georgia is turning from sort of an olive color, and I know it's not the easiest to see. These maps are from the USDA, I didn't make them. We can see that they get a mustard color up in Georgia there. That's the same plant hardiness zone that citrus grows in now. So it could be that instead of Georgia peaches, we're talking about Georgia oranges by 2050. It's going to be just a transforming agricultural story. When we want to look at big changes to the winters, the area of the country that's going to experience the biggest winter changes are over here east of the Great Lakes. Many people think of the UP of Michigan as potentially being a climate destination because it's known for winter sports. They figure it'll stay cool. Right now, we can see that it's in like a zone 4, zone 5 winter, a cold winter. Some parts of the UP are projected to become as warm in the winter as Northern Virginia is today. You see good cool preservation, good cold winter preservation as you move into Wisconsin. But there are some places where there's dramatic change until you get up north into upstate New York, northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont, and Maine away from the coast. A lot of this area east of the Great Lakes is going to experience fairly dramatic winter warming trends. From some people's perspective, that might make the climate more tolerable, more appealing as a destination. We can see Buffalo as a potentially really big hotspot. Buffalo is experiencing probably a 2 plant hardiness zone change all the way up to zone 7, which we can see zone 7 is like Tennessee today. That's a tremendous amount of change. It will transform landscapes, but we're only talking about heat and cold right now. I feel like to build a richer picture, we also need to know what's going on with precipitation. Fortunately, we have seasonal trends projected for mid-century around seasonal precipitation across the US. Starting in the Southwest right now, unfortunately, we can see that that drying trend in the Southwest is likely to continue and get worse, centered in Arizona. This is a big problem. This is an area that's already water stressed. So Arizona and Southern California produce a lot of our nation's table crops. If you're eating salad in the winter, it's probably coming from Arizona. So the amount of water stress coming into this critical agricultural area in the spring, and it's going to be hit with more drought in the fall, year round, less rain to Arizona. there won't be a chance for recharge. It's a very challenging outlook. In California, we see that there's this drop in summer precipitation. Most of California, though, gets its rain in the spring. I do worry when we see these changes in summer precipitation about Oregon. This is a big part of why Washington has a stronger climate outlook than Oregon, is this serious drought trend for Oregon, particularly in terms of summer precipitation. You'll notice the summer precipitation looks like it's dropping pretty bad over most of the country. And, being in Iowa, in a farming area, everyone is very aware of the drought this year and last year that made it very challenging to get the crop down the Mississippi to the Gulf so that it could go out internationally. It is likely that trend is going to continue. Low water flows in the fall for the Mississippi, where we might need to change the shipping season. Because here's a place where there is hope. We look at this very dry trend over this area where we saw the potential extension in the growing season. It looks like it will be counterbalanced by statistically significant increases in winter and spring precipitation. Many of the aquifers in this area are very readily rechargeable. So with a hydrology approach, where we care for groundwater, we monitor groundwater, and we use irrigation responsibly and sustainably, we could realize this hope of increased agricultural production at a time when the world is going to need US crops more than ever. There is really good, I'd like to point out, stability down in Georgia in that potential citrus growing region. Some of the least change in precipitation outlook that we see over the whole year. I really feel like we need to keep eyes on some of this good potential in the Southeast, because if we embrace change, we get ready for it, there will be some people who manage to make an opportunity out of a change situation. This is all very serious, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to solve our problems and look for the bright spots when we can. Looking at the eastern seaboard, we can see that this area is not going to be as impacted by the drought trend year by year in the summer, but that we will expect to see more and heavy precipitation in the winter and spring. So like we saw this year with a need to build resilience against flooding, building resilience against flooding in Vermont and New Hampshire, and there are already excellent studies and projects underway to prepare for this increased refall. It's going to be critical for building climate resilience. So as we put together these pieces, because I don't want to walk too much longer, I want to make sure we have time for questions. I want to think about the question that is very dear to most of us, that's very serious to most of us, is what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my home? And I think that when we see the reality that most Americans are going to be able to stay in their homes if we take action, this is enormous hope. Climate can be so scary that people feel a sense of despair or they want to look away. But we have a hope that needs to be realized, and we can only do that through our good work. I do want to talk about places where some folks are going to need to leave, though, some places where the outlook is challenging. So in these yellow areas, these are places where with resilience measures, communities will mostly be able to remain intact. These orange hexagons do not mean everyone needs to run away screaming. They mean that some people are going to be in particularly threatened areas. And I want to talk about that related to this patch of densely populated East Coast territory. Most of the people who are going to need to relocate in this area, it's because of direct threats from sea level rise. From Massachusetts to Long Island to Chesapeake Bay, those three locations are very vulnerable to sea level rise. People's homes are being impacted now at those locations. If you're interested in checking out what sea level rise is projected for your community, I'll drop a link in the chat for the NOAA sea level rise viewer. It's very easy to use, and you can put your address in and see if you're likely to be impacted. So when we talk about the need to have people move out of these areas, it's because of sea level rise, not because of overall horrifying conditions. When we look down here at the Western Gulf, same thing, serious impacts of sea level rise. For Texas alone, the Texas Gulf Coast, By 2050, the insurance companies are projecting 30 billion with a B dollars of direct property loss. So this is going to change the real estate market tremendously. We're going to see a lot of that in the entire Gulf Coast. It's going to be most intense on the Western Gulf Coast. Southern Florida, the combination of sea level rise, the increased heat, and that drying trend. If we go back, we can see that Florida, the southern tip of Florida, is going to be getting less rain year round. So that's difficult when you're dealing with the increased heat. I feel like this is not a red alarm, get out of Florida now. But if you're a person who's thinking about continuing a family legacy there, you really need to know what you're up against. You really need to build resilience if you want to dig in. Talking about the Southwest a little bit more, you know, a lot of this is related to water stress, is related to concerns about increased heat and increased water stress. I think it's worth noting that the outlook for Northern California, and particularly coastal Northern California, is not as challenging as the rest of the state. In fact, some parts of the central to northern coast have amongst the most stable climate outlooks in the nation. You should check out Eureka, California, if you're interested in a place with really good stability and a beautiful classic Northern California vibe. When we look at the difference between these light blue and these dark blue hexagons, this reflects back to this conversation we were having about the importance of farmland and the importance of water. Even though we're looking at a relatively privileged outlook for the US versus the whole global outlook for 2050, we don't have an infinite amount of resources. We don't have an infinite amount of farmland that has potential for increased production. And we are going to have a lot of people wanting to come here, needing to come here from areas with more challenging climate outlooks. If we're able to encourage development, urban development in places that are rich in water, it's going to work out better for everyone. I would say that these areas here, these dark blue hexagons in the northern Midwest, are amongst our most important areas to develop, to take people in, both from within, who are displaced from within the US, and from outside of the US. This is an area where the groundwater has not been abused, where we could take care of the groundwater and have sustainable water use, and where historically there have been more people living there than there are today. We know the area can take more population. If we look over in the Northeast, we see another potential for an area for increased urban development, for helping people to live quality, just lives as we move into 2050. And the same is true in Washington. Although this area, as many of you in the area know, is more prone to natural disasters than other parts of the United States, and it's likely that atmospheric rivers will be hitting it more frequently than has before. And we know those atmospheric rivers, they bring a whole series of problems with them, right? As well as the rain that we need. So when we look at places to grow, we've really got not just one, but 3 potential destination areas in the US. We have areas where there's a potential for transformative change, that if we don't understand it and work to harness change, it could be very devastating. But if we work with the change, if we support landscape transformation, if we support crop transformation, there's a lot of hope for providing a good life to Americans and contributing to global well-being. Thanks so much for talking with me today. I'm going to stop the share, and thanks again for the opportunity. I think I'll log out and go see if my kids are asleep or not. So have a good evening.
You too. Thanks. Okay.